We're talking today with Glenn Gronevelt of Grand Haven, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Glenn, can you start us off with some background on yourself, and just to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in 1947 in Grand Haven, and my father was in business as construction with his brother doing small work, and so my construction background started out roughly at 12 years old.
Okay.
There was some nice free labor there for Dad for a while. I lived in Grand Haven my whole life. The only time I've been away from Grand Haven was with my tour in Vietnam.
Okay.
And
then
back again.
Okay. And then when did you finish high school?
I finished high school in '65, went on to junior college, wasn't sure what was going to happen, so I took a lot of various courses, graduated with an associate degree in drafting about 1968.
Okay.
And Vietnam was getting very hot and heavy at that time, and I was dating my wife at the time, and we had marriage on our minds, and so we were kind of watching and trying to fit everything into, because we figured I was going to get drafted. The lottery for the draft had not quite started yet, so she had a nursing degree. She was a graduate RN, and we were looking at opportunities, and the recruiters were talking to both of us as a pair, and recruiters were promising a lot at that point in time. So one of the things that came up was, if you have construction background, the Navy was willing to offer you rank to go into the service. And by starting at 12 years old, not full time of course, but working with Dad and my uncle, I obtained enough construction to go in as an E7 if my way of counting took place. But the Navy recruiter said, nah, we're going to give you E5, and we're going to call you a carpenter, or in the construction battalion it was called a builder.
Okay. Now, for people who don't understand the code, I mean, the military has different grades and levels, and E is for enlisted, 5 and E5 in the Army is sort of the lowest level of sergeant. And in the Navy, what does that correspond to?
The E5 would be a second class petty officer. E4 would be third class, and then E1 through 3 was enlisted.
Mm-hmm.
E7, 8, and 9 were chief, senior chief, and master chief.
Right.
And I went into the service. I went down for my physical 3 times to Detroit. Each time the recruiter said you may or may not move on to basic training depending if there's an opening. So the 3rd time I went down, the opening was there.
Okay.
And I
roughly when was this that this was happening?
This would be about January, February time frame of '69.
Okay. Now, did you ever get a draft notice?
I did. The 3rd time I went down for a physical was on a Friday. That Saturday, I never got back home. I went right on to Gulfport, Mississippi, but that Saturday in the mail, a draft notice came. So it was that close. I missed it by 1 day. Had I received the draft notice and gone in that way, I would have been E1, and who knows what branch of the service.
Right.
You know.
Okay. Now, when you did the physical 3 times, so there's a lot of stories about things that went on at physicals, people trying to beat the system and that sort of thing. Did you observe any of that?
Constantly, yes. There were a lot of guys over there trying to beat, playing dumb on the color blindness test, or drinking a lot of coffee and caffeine Coke and that sort of thing the day before to get the blood pressure way up. And the guys who were giving the physicals, while it was pretty, much like an assembly line, they knew the stories. They knew what was going on. So they would set these guys aside and say, okay, your blood pressure's too high. Go sit in that chair for a couple hours. Well, you ended up hurting yourself, you know. So you just had to wait that much longer for your physical. Or they'd send you home. But yes, there was a lot of people trying different things to get out of the service.
Okay. Now, at the time that you're doing this, how much did you know about Vietnam, or what was your impression of that?
Paul Harvey at that time was a guy who did a lot of talking at noon, and we would listen to Paul Harvey around our noon meal time at home. And so I was listening to what he was saying. You'd see it on the TV every night, but that was about the extent of what I was involved with. I wasn't taking a political point of view, or I wasn't taking a moralistic point of view at that point in my life. Kind of a fatalistic point of view. I said, if I have to go, I have to go,
okay,
type of thing.
Do you remember what kind of attitude Paul Harvey had?
At that time, I can remember a transition in Paul Harvey. He was kind of pro and positive, and then towards the end it started, well, why is this thing dragging on? Why aren't we doing more? Why are we losing all these lives, you know? And what are we gaining by it? You know, and so at the end, before I left, Paul was starting to go a little bit negative.
Okay.
On the war.
And to a certain extent, kind of a barometer of public opinion almost, too. It's what
Yes.
he's hearing from people and what he's
Yes.
seeing. Okay, so you're going to go in, and but you've got kind of a specialization all lined up. They've offered you a rank at this kind of thing. So now you go down to Gulfport, Mississippi for... Now, did you do a Navy boot camp first, or did you go straight to...
Went straight down to Gulfport, Mississippi, and we had kind of it was a 5-week course, introduction into the service. You learned what rank and rating were. You learned the history of the Seabees, where they got started in basically World War II, and how to recognize even perhaps some of the symbols of rank, so that you always saluted properly, you know. You were kind of taught that you're not an individual, you are part of a machine, okay, kind of a cog in a wheel type of thing. But it wasn't the same as a lot of the other basics, especially Marines, where you were broken down and you became part of a team rather than the individual. Mm-hmm. This was more generalized, and you'd already gotten what the Navy wanted to teach you in the construction, so they were kind of treating you with a little bit more respect. But you were still pigeonholed, so to speak. You always had to say sir. You were always, how do you want to say it? You knew where your place was. So after the 5 weeks of training, they also had a screening process where you were given rank by the recruiter, and then the screening process took place there, and they evaluated your history to some extent, and then reclassified. And as a result of that screening process, I was changed from a builder to a steel worker, and I was dropped 1 grade in rank. They refused to recognize any of my work experience be under 18 years of age. So at 22, I only had 21 at that point. I only had 3 years. You had to have 4 years experience to have E5. Mm-hmm. I was somewhat gullible because I had a lot more. In the end, it turned out I had a lot more experience and abilities between my drafting ability and the work experience. I probably could have stayed E5 if I had fought it, but they told us at the time, you may take this bust in rank down 1 pay grade, or we'll release you from the service. which at first didn't sound too bad, but then they added the little line, before you get home, you will be E1 and you'll have a draft notice in the mail.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a little blackmail on their part. And I thought, yeah, E4 is a whole lot better than E1, and you don't know what E1's going to end up doing. So I took the bust in rank and ended up in Vietnam.
Okay. Now, in this training session, did they do a lot of the spit and polish stuff? You know, how you had to have your uniform and make your bed and all those kinds of things?
Yes. We had daily inspections, and we had daily penalties if you didn't meet it, and everybody got a penalty at some point in time during that 5 weeks. Your boots weren't polished, your bed wasn't tight enough, your locker wasn't in order, you didn't shave properly. So I mean, there was a lot of, they called Mickey Mouse, there was a lot of that, and it was just intimidation primarily. And so everybody had to go through the punishment for that at some point in time.
Okay. Now, the group you're training with, were these all guys like yourself who had construction experience, or was it a mix of people?
It was a mix of people. And as we talked about earlier about guys trying to beat the physical exam, there were guys like that in the service here too, who saw an opportunity and tried to make the best of a bad situation. I knew of one used car salesman out of New York who was truly a used car salesman, and he went in as an heavy-duty equipment operator, and he talked his way through and maintained his rank, and all he was doing was selling used cars. He was not an equipment operator, so he got on the job training later. All the guys that I went through the service with at that point in time went different ways, went to different battalions, went to different units. And of all of them that I went to through the 5-week training with, only one went with me, or ended up with me, I should say, in Vietnam. There was a change later on in our battalion, and this fella from Hastings, Michigan, no less, ended up with me in Vietnam. So I never saw any of the other ones again.
Now, do you have an idea if any of the others got orders for Vietnam but somewhere else, or?
Oh, definitely. Just about every Seabee battalion went to Vietnam. The battalions themselves that were home ported in the United States would rotate in and out of Vietnam. They would go in for approximately 9 months, rotate back out for 6 months in the States, rotate back in for another 9 months, and then back out again. Whereas the maintenance units that I got assigned to, and there were 2 of them, your tour of duty was 12 months. And basically the rule in Vietnam at that time was if you served 12 months, you did not have to go back to Vietnam for at least another 12 months.
All right. Now, how long was the enlistment initially when you signed up?
Our Seabee enlistment was a little unusual. We had to sign on for 30 months, whereas a normal enlistment was 24.
Right.
The reason for that is because of the general Seabee rotation. You had to have 3 months in country first, 90 days in country first in the United States before you could be shipped overseas. They shipped me early, and I can tell you about that a little later, of the results of that. But 3 months active duty in the States, then you'd go over for 9, rotate back out for 6, go back over for 9, and sometimes the 9 wasn't a full 9, sometimes more or less, sometimes the 6 wasn't a full 6, more or less, but it averaged out 30 months. So when you enlisted as a Seabee, even though you got nice rank, your enlistment was 30 months instead of 24.
Yeah, and in some cases you may well get 2 tours of Vietnam rather than just 1, even though they're not the
Typically you
full
would.
year.
In a regular battalion, you would get 2 tours.
Okay, so you spend 5 weeks in training in Gulfport, and then what do they do with you?
I got leave, 18-day leave after that, and went home and got married. And then moved out to California, Port Hueneme, which is one of the major bases for Seabees battalions, and had additional military, what they called military training there. We learned how to storm foxholes, machine gun nests, that sort of thing out in the hills. That lasted for, I think, 4 weeks, something like that. And then we were shipped out. I, again, going to a maintenance battalion, I was the only one. And so I got shipped out to Seattle, Tacoma, and spent the night on that base and by myself. They didn't even give me a barracks, no bed, no nothing. I just had to wander around the base till 7 o'clock the next morning when I got on a plane and flew straight out to Vietnam via Guam and then right into Vietnam.
Okay. Was this a chartered civilian jet or was it a military one?
This was chartered civilian. I flew out of the United States and then back into the United States on, I think it was TWA at that time.
Yeah, and they were using pretty much all the major airlines that flew
Yes,
that way,
yes.
did that kind of thing. Okay. I guess so when do you actually arrive in Vietnam then?
I think it was about June 1st I got into Vietnam, and actually it was almost like a weekend, Saturday, Sunday, and the battalion really wasn't, they had the weekend off type of thing.
Okay. Well, you're flying, and where did you land when you?
I landed in Cam Ranh.
Okay.
I remember walking off the plane in my Navy blues because the white uniform didn't start quite yet. I missed it by a day or two. And oh, was that hot. Very, very hot. And walked out the door of the plane and you get hit with the jungle smell, even in Cam Ranh. It was just, you never forget a smell like that. And then I went through processing right there at the airport, and it wasn't till almost 10 o'clock at night before they finally got a pickup truck to transport 4 or 5 guys all the way down to the end of the peninsula of Cam Ranh. That's where my Seabees battalion was stationed. And we went out in the dark, and I'm extremely green, don't know, and I see all these flares going off, and you hear, you go past a mortar nest and they sent off another flare, and I'd never had a mortar experience, so I didn't know what that was. And we went past an ammo dump with high security and guards all over the place, and I'm thinking, oh, I hope this doesn't, nothing happens here, you know. Not realizing that the peninsula, the farther you went down the peninsula, basically the safer you got, because everything above you was military combat units. And so we had it pretty nice at the end of the peninsula. But I didn't know that at the time. So I was pretty shook up going out that night.
Okay. And then what kind of reception do you get when you arrive?
That night, here's a bunk, and that was it. And it wasn't till Monday morning that I was directed to my battalion headquarters to start the sign-in process. So I spent almost 2 days in the barracks, and I had to find out where the chow halls were, and then, you know, found out where the beach was, and it was just a pristine beach, beautiful, beautiful beach, and this sort of thing. But it was a jungle area around. We were in kind of a horseshoe-shaped area, hills all the way around us, and then the beach out in front. And but it was definitely jungle, sandy, hot, totally different from Michigan. Nothing I'd ever seen before.
All right. Now, how were the barracks put together? What do those look like?
Barracks were pretty decent. They had basically 4 cots, 2 bunks to a small semi-partitioned off. The partitions did not go to the ceiling, only for ventilation purposes. They had huge fans blowing air from one end of the barracks to the other. They had a small room at the end of each barracks that was separated from the sleeping quarters, and that was air conditioned for the guys. They could play cards, read a book, that sort of thing. 2 stories high, and the upper floor was exactly the same as the lower floor. Just lots of bunks. And then bathroom facilities, showers, that sort of thing, was a separate building alongside, and then another barracks. So I mean, 4 floors of barracks shared the same bathroom facilities. But it was hot and cold running water, showers, flush toilets. So overall, not bad.
By Vietnam standards, luxurious.
Yes, yes. We had, of course, being construction battalion, we had the ability to build what we wanted, whereas we did get off base after a period of time, and we got to see some of the other facilities. Army, in our point of view, had the worst condition on Cam Ranh. Air Force, they were a world by themselves. I mean, they had sidewalks, they had flower boxes under some of the windows. I mean, they had it pretty good.
Okay. Did you have bunkers near the barracks, or did they not bother with that?
No, we had bunkers. They had sandbag bunkers built between barracks. The farther up the peninsula you go, the more bunkers and facilities for protection you saw. I stayed at the end of the peninsula, and it was pretty wide open. I stayed at the Naval Air Facility, also farther up the peninsula, for a period of time, and they had 55-gallon drums stacked all around the lower floors of every barracks, filled with sand, and they had bunkers between. Up there, we saw harassment attacks by VC. We saw a lot of rocket and mortar attacks coming in, and the sirens would go off. You'd roll out your bunks and hit the bunkers. By harassment, they weren't able to really aim them, so I mean, it was just a way of, hopefully they might do some damage, but they would time it for like 4:35 in the morning. So the sirens would go off, you roll out, hit the bunkers, wait a half hour for things to calm down, or an hour, whatever it took, and then go back to your bunkers, or back to your beds. Well, at that time in the morning, you weren't going back to sleep. So you'd look around, see what damage was done, if any, and sit around, twiddle your thumbs for a half hour or so, and then until the chow hall opened up, and then start your day.
Right. Now, you'd get more of that with the air station than you did at where the Seabee base was?
Correct. Occasionally at the Seabee base, which was at the very end of the peninsula, you'd have a little harassment. Very, very little harassment. Sniper fire once in a while. And so you just, you wouldn't worry about things like that.
Would the snipers be on the peninsula or shooting at you from across somewhere else?
Oh, the peninsula was very big, and the bay between the mainland and the peninsula itself was far too far for rifle fire. Right. Individuals would come down and sit in the ridge around the base and shoot down into it once in a while. But I would say probably in the 13 months that I was in Vietnam, the snipers, you could probably count on one hand the number of times it happened. They did find a couple of them trying to infiltrate from the sea one time, and they captured them and put them in a Connex box, and then got a Seabee to come in with a cutting torch and cut a couple holes for ventilation in the thing, and kept him in the Connex box for a couple hours until people from up the peninsula who had authority to handle prisoners came down and took him back out. don't know what happened to him after that.
All right. So we're going to go back into the main part of your story here. You got there, you spend the weekend kind of waiting for something to happen. Now you get to Monday. Now what do they do with you?
They took me in. We processed all the paperwork. I was assigned to a company, and they took your picture showing, and you got to send the picture back home showing he's arrived safe and sound type of thing to your loved ones, family, in my case my wife, and saying he's here. Then I spent basically the next 6 months in Cam Ranh itself doing maintenance work for various things in the area right down at the end of the peninsula.
Okay. Now what specific battalion were you assigned to?
My battalion was a CBMU 302.
And what does that translate to?
Construction Battalion Maintenance Unit, and our number was 302. There were 2 maintenance units in Vietnam. 301 handled the northern half of Vietnam, 302 handled the southern half of Vietnam, and we were assigned maintenance of various naval facilities. It could be a air facility, it could be a naval facility. I did work at the air facility quite a bit, which was farther up the peninsula. Down the road from our battalion headquarters, we had PBR boats and some swift boats, and I was doing dock maintenance for them as well. So basically we were doing facilities maintenance for Navy, and then we'd get individual teams, 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 guys, depending on the size of the project, and we would be transferred anywhere in the 2 corps, southern 2 corps, to do a couple days to a couple of weeks maintenance type of thing.
Okay. Now you were designated as a steel worker, so did you work just with metals or did you do a lot of different things?
At that time, we were doing a lot of metal work. We were building, for one example, we built what's called mud boxes for the masons. They'd hand mix their mud, hand mix the cement and mortar, and we would build those type of things. I was doing a lot of welding at the time on repair work. The base kitchen needed new exhaust fans put in. So a team of 5 guys were assigned to do this work. We would have to go in at basically 7, 8 o'clock at night into the facility and begin our work. And the cooks were just really happy to have us there doing all this work for them. So they gave us access to the coolers and kitchens. Said, you guys are working night shift. We're not here to serve you like we are during the day. You do yourself. So basically we took one of our guys and assigned him the griddle. And he was cooking meals for us, as steaks and eggs and you name it. We'd go into the coolers and get it ourselves and fix whatever we wanted, while the rest of the team was repairing the exhaust fans. That lasted about a week, a week and a half type of thing. So I mean, these are the types of jobs we were doing. I would say what I was doing for the first 5, 6 months.
Okay. In that period, was there kind of a daily routine?
Yeah, so to speak. We'd get up in the morning, attend roll call, meet with our particular company, and then the whole battalion would mass in the form of companies, individual companies, and everyone was accounted for. And then we'd go about whatever maintenance needed to be done for the day. We'd quit about 5 o'clock at night, go in, clean up, hit the chow hall, got to watch, movies at night in the theater, or go to the EM club, or find any kind of recreation we wanted to do basically from 5 o'clock on till the next morning. We were pretty much on our own most of the time. Once in a great while, they would hold the military drill where you'd have to practice going to the bunkers or going to a fighting position, or uh, basically get holed up in one central location for direction. Okay, we need 5 guys over here, or a squad over here, or that, something like that. But um, pretty much from 5 to the next morning, you were on your own.
Mhm. Now, did men from your unit have to provide any people for perimeter security or anything else like that, or securing your own part of the base?
The actual security of the base itself at that point in time, no. We did have to supply shore patrol duty, and I got assigned to that a number of times. Basically, you were just kind of acting as a police, temporary police. You had to carry a pistol, you had to carry a white belt, a badge, a nightstick, that sort of thing. And you walked the base. You were checking the movie theaters to make sure nothing got out of hand. You were assigned to the EM clubs. Never, to my knowledge, did we get assigned to the officers club, but the EM clubs. I got assigned one time to the EM club the night a group of Filipino girls came in, and I was stationed outside their dressing room door to make sure there was no lines being crossed at that time. So, but generally speaking, just shore patrol duties, not actual protection.
Right. Okay. Now, I mean, did they have bar fights and things like that? Did you have some work to do on shore patrol?
Generally, in my particular case, I was fortunate. I didn't run into any real. Basically, if you were shore patrol and the shore patrol approached you, you were given respect, and you were backed up 100% from up the chain of command, so to speak. So the guys knew that if you crossed the line with shore patrol, you were crossing the line farther up, and you were going to get in trouble. So I personally didn't have any, but there were instances, yes.
And would you be mostly just policing the guys out of your own battalion and just stay in your area,
No.
or would you go anywhere in the base?
No, our base held a number of different units, and I don't really remember everything about it. Primarily sailors, but there were Air Force and there were Army down there as well. And your shore patrol duty covered the gamut of everything.
Okay. Now, in your base area, did you have Vietnamese civilians working there at all? Anything like
We
that?
had a lot of Vietnamese civilians working with us. They would be picked up by bus at the village in the morning, brought to the American base. They would do whatever work was required at that time. We had one particular individual named Dang Tin, very nice older fella. He worked with us in the steel shop, and he was learning how to weld, and he was learning metalworking. We could do a lot of different types of metal fabrication, sheet metal work, heavy plate gauge, that sort of thing. So we were teaching him. Very nice guy. We got along real well with him. There were a lot of others who were house cleaning, just general labor work. And then at night, they would be put into a holding area, and they would be searched and evaluated, making sure they weren't taking anything off the base that they weren't supposed to. And then they got on the bus and then back to the villages again.
Was there concern that some of these people were VC or anything like that?
I didn't detect it at our base in Cam Ranh, but I did get out into some of the smaller bases, and there was a very, very big concern. I got out to one small base, and the week before, a couple weeks before, the guys were telling me how their Vietnamese barber was, during the day, cutting hair, and then one night they had a VC attack, and the next morning went out and found his body hanging on the wire. So I mean, they were, a lot of the VC were in the camps. You didn't really know. You suspected, but you didn't really know who was and who wasn't. And so yeah, there was in the smaller bases, it was more of a concern. But in my base at Cam Ranh itself, not so much.
Okay. Now, during the first 5 months or so, did you basically just work on the base and not go other places, or did you get off the base?
No, I did not get off the base.
Okay.
For the first 5-6 months, I was assigned to whatever maintenance was necessary on the base. We did manage to take vehicles and move up the base to the big PXs where we could buy cameras and fans and big things, big item things if we wanted it, refrigerators, small refrigerator units. There was a small PX on the base, but it didn't handle a lot of the big stuff. So we were allowed to take vehicles up to the big ones and move around the peninsula itself. But as far as assignment goes, no. For the first 5-6 months, I stayed right on the base itself.
Okay. So then after that that period, now your job changes, or what happens then to make things different?
I got assigned to a small detachment of 5 guys, and we were moved out to a little fishing village called Cat Low. And our job at that point was to assemble pontoons, cubes, into a barge for transporting whatever they wanted up and down the Saigon River. Cat Low was on the Saigon River itself. So we spent about 2 weeks, 3 weeks there building barges. These pontoon barges were similar to the pontoons that were used in World War II, and we just basically put them into pieces, or took the pieces, put them into pontoon forms, and welded them up, and then they were used for transport later on.
Okay. Now, were you staying on an American base, or what was the situation there?
It was a very, very small base. It had a tank farm on it, just about a block away from the barracks. It was an Army base. They had 155 millimeter howitzers on the base, and they would fire out. Basically surrounding the small base was chain link fence, and that was the extent of our protection. There were bunkers and stuff for protection for us as well, but pretty wide open. And I remember the early stationing there. I was not familiar with the howitzers at all, and I'm laying in my bunk at night. It was still light out, and all I had on was my underwear, and there was this huge explosion, and I had no idea what it was. You fall out of the top bunk. I went right into my shoes, my flak jacket, my helmet, and that's all, and I dove out the door into the bunker. And a couple of more loud explosions, and I look out the slots in the bunkers, and I see people just walking the streets nonchalantly, and nobody else is coming into the bunker. I have no idea what's going on. So after a few more of these loud explosions, I finally work up the courage. I go back into the barracks, and here's the guys just laughing like crazy. It was the howitzers going off, shooting rounds out, and I had, like I said, I had never heard anything that loud or didn't know what it was, and I was pretty scared at the time because I thought it was incoming rounds. But you soon learn to tell the difference between outgoing and incoming.
All right. Now, what other kinds of things did you do in those later months while you were there?
After the finishing up in Cat Low, came back, spent a little time back in Cam Ranh, got assigned to another battalion or a detachment. We went out to Newport, which is in Saigon. It's a small area called Newport, and it's a naval facility. And what it was an incoming warehousing area. The ships would come up the Saigon River and unload at Newport, with all kinds of supplies. And these warehouses would hold the supplies until it got distributed throughout the country. And they needed there were a group of warehouses end to end with an opening between the ends, and they wanted to enclose that end to get more storage space. So our job was to build that extension between the warehouses, basically to roof it over, like a carport, more or less. And we spent, I'm going to say 4 or 5 weeks there building that one. Came back to Vietnam, or to Cam Ranh again, and got assigned to building a 2-building schoolhouse that was going to be used to train Vietnamese sailors in.
Now, was this on the Cam Ranh base itself?
This one was on the Cam Ranh base itself. And this was the start of what was called President Nixon's Vietnamization policy, where bases were being turned over to the Vietnamese. It was also public pressure to pull out of Vietnam at that time. And so there was a little, here's where some of the deception started taking place. President Nixon was pulling these Seabees battalions out of Vietnam, decommissioning the battalions. And this was being played up in the newspaper. X number of men were now taken out of Vietnam. What they didn't tell you was that these men had a 10-day, 20, 30-day leave and turn around and sent back to Vietnam to the battalions that stayed in Vietnam. My battalion strength went from basically 200, 250 men up to almost 1,700 men. Yes, all these troops were decommissioned. That's what you saw on the news, but you didn't see the buildup of the battalions that still remained behind. Our focus for my battalion changed from maintenance of naval facilities to also building these villages alongside the American bases that were being turned over to the Vietnamese. This way the soldier could have his family move into the housing right next to the base, and that would keep the soldier, the Vietnamese soldier, on the base and with his unit. It helped prevent the high desertion rate that was taking place over there in the Vietnamese armies. So we built villages with rooms and indoor plumbing, so to speak. So they were nicer facilities than a lot of the Vietnamese were seeing at that time. This is where one of the things that I got involved with is I had seen a lot of structural steel in the back storage compound area of our battalion. Basically, it's stuff we didn't know what to do with, couldn't use anymore, and I saw enough components in there to make a steel building. So I went to one of my officers and says, "There's a building there. I can give you the full blueprints of everything that's out there. I can draw you the blueprints, and so we can build a building." And they kind of dragged their feet on it for a little bit, and then all of a sudden it became a hot project because it became the very first concrete block factory in Vietnam. So I drew the plans, measured the steel, drew all the blueprints for it, foundation on up through the peak, and then they gave me the blueprints for the actual block making machine, and I incorporated that into the building. We had to make some building adjustments, height-wise and also drain-wise, foundational-wise. The story that we got, and rumors were flying in Vietnam all over the place constantly. This was one of the rumors we heard, was that this particular concrete block machine was scheduled to go to Antarctica. And they redirected it to Vietnam as part of the Vietnamization process. So the block machine was brought in, added to the building, and it became the first concrete block factory in Vietnam. And it became such a big political thing as well. We had the chief of naval operations come to Vietnam to visit this particular block machine. And of course, my battalion commander was all, he was a lieutenant commander at that point in time. And it certainly helped his career, I'm sure. So then later on, one of my movements again was to build a second factory outside of Saigon, halfway between Saigon and Long Binh. And I got on that team as well and built a second factory out there.
Okay. Now, do you get an offer of promotion or anything along the line, or they just leave you as the E4 and?
I was a young kid with a lot of immaturity at the time. And one of the things that the Navy offered was a rewards program for benefits, positive things. So I helped my public affairs officer helped me put a proposal together, and we did a cost estimate, and supposedly I would get a $300 bonus. Well, back in the early 70s, $300 was a pretty big thing. And when it got processed through, my company commander knocked it down to $25. And I became pretty black and white over the thing. And they offered me the 25, and I says, no, if I accept the 25, that's the end of it. I'm not gonna accept 25. I want the full 300. And it dragged on and dragged on, and I finally wrote my congressman about it. And very immature thing to do. Who's going to win? Come on, guys, let's face the facts here. Congressman wrote back to the battalion commander. The battalion commander gave his story. Nope, it wasn't going to happen. At the end of my tour, the offer of 25 was still on the table. I finally said, well, I'm going to take 25 and walk away from Vietnam with at least 25 in my pocket. And in the end, they gave me 20 because there was a 20% tax on top of this yet. So, but I should have kept my mouth shut. Okay, that was the wrong thing to do. I should have gone with the flow. Had I gone with the flow and an opportunity to talk, who knows what might have happened, but obviously I showed capabilities greater than my rank at that time, so I would have hoped for, a possible promotion, but no, it didn't happen.
Okay. So you worked a couple of times on projects in or near Saigon. How was working there different from working at Cam Ranh Bay?
Because I was in a small detachment of just a couple of guys, we didn't have a lot of the Mickey Mouse type of thing to deal with. I got to travel throughout Saigon, got familiar with the town itself, saw some of the cultural things in Saigon, the Saigon Zoo, and some of the presidential palace. I could only see that from the outside, but I went past it every day. Some of the pagodas, some of the embassies, some of the different restaurants. Tried to sample some of the Vietnamese foods that way. The Saigon market, where you could buy anything and everything you wanted, and that means everything. You wanted drugs, you wanted sex, you wanted produce, meats. Everything you wanted was in that market. So yeah, I got to see quite a bit of Saigon and learned what was going on there. And it was a lot less structured. So
Were there rules for, were you told things what you could and couldn't do in Saigon, or how you had to behave when you were there, or did they just turn you loose?
basically they turned us loose. You still had to respect rank. You had the big PXs there, and across, of course, officers and enlisted men and warrant officers would all come into that PX, and you had to act according to your rank in those situations. There was a lot of black market available for everyone. It was amazing how if you bought a carton of Salem cigarettes, menthol cigarettes, it was a big thing to the Vietnamese. You could buy a full carton of cigarettes for $1.50. And that carton of cigarettes would buy you just about anything you want. You could trade it on the black market to any taxi driver, barkeeper, whatever, and get 10 times your money back if you wanted it. It was just amazing what you could do with some of that. Box of Tide, those, everyday supplies to you. You could go in, even some of the bartenders, and I have to admit I did it, they would give you American money, MPC. You go to the PX, you buy his list of grocery items and bring it back and give it to him. Give him the change if there was any change left. And your bar bill might have been taken care of for a month. It was that high of a return on some of this stuff. So yeah, we as individual guys, we got around, again, our day was 8 to 5, 7 to 5, and then we were free in between, or after 5 o'clock until 7 o'clock the next morning, do whatever.
Did you have to worry at all about security if you were out at night or things like that? Would you carry a weapon or go with somebody else? Or
We did not carry weapons itself. There was a curfew. There was a 10 o'clock curfew. You had to be off the streets, and the MPs were pretty strict about that. Basically from after 10 o'clock at night, you'd better not show your face on the thing. But a lot of freedom. Some of the guys I knew, I was married at the time, I didn't get involved in it, but some of the guys rented an apartment on their own, and it was very easy to have a girl come and stay with you and provide laundry services and cooking services for you at night at your apartment. You didn't have to go back to your assigned barracks per se. As long as you showed up at 7 o'clock the next morning, made roll call, you were on your own. You were a lot of freedom that way.
Okay. Now, how long total were you in Vietnam?
I was in Vietnam for 13 months,
Okay.
even though the normal tour of duty for a Seabee in these two maintenance units was 12 months. I ended up with 13. The reason being, when you enlisted into the service, you had to, at the time, stay in country in the United States for 90 days before they could ship you overseas. After I completed my training and being an individual, they shipped me out, and when I got to Vietnam, I discovered that rule, and they had shipped me out early. And so with this 30-month enlistment, it was possible for me to go back to the United States after my 12 months of duty, yes, and spend a full 12 months stationed someplace else, and who knows where that might have been, from Rota, Spain to Antarctica to who knows where, and then have enough time left in my enlistment to come back to Vietnam. And I didn't want that at the time. They also had a program where you could voluntarily stay over in your battalion for 1, 2, 3, 6 months. And I found out if I volunteered to stay over an extra month in Vietnam, that 12-month rule came into play, and I would not have enough time in my enlistment to go back to Vietnam. So I figured 1 month here under these conditions is a whole lot better than perhaps another 12 months later. So I volunteered an extra month.
Okay. Now, with that over a year being there, did you have an R&R or leave time?
I had an R&R. I could take one R&R for sure, and they were generous enough. You could take more R&R if you wanted to. I didn't. I had an R&R. I arrived in country in June of '69, and I took a February of '70 R&R to Hawaii. I met my wife in Hawaii. I had 5 days in Hawaii. The government paid for my full flight over there. I had to make my own arrangements for lodging and meals, of course, after that. And the government also paid for my wife's flight to and from Vietnam. She came over and spent 9 days in Hawaii, and then I only got to spend 5. She met a couple in Vietnam, or in Hawaii. Their son was a Marine and he got posted to Vietnam. And within weeks after arriving in Vietnam, he was killed. Now, this friend was the best friend of my dad, and so we grew up together. The kid and I knew each other very, very well. And at first, I was asked to escort that body home. And then the family decided the last minute not to, because every time they would see me after that, it would be a negative reminder of their son. But that's a side story. But yeah, I spent 5 days in Hawaii with my wife, and then went back to Vietnam for approximately another 5 months almost.
Okay. And over the course of the time you're in Vietnam, and especially as you start to get into other parts of the country, into Saigon, and see just how the society functions and all of this, how did your view of the war or the American involvement there, did that develop or change at all?
It did. My brother-in-law had been in Vietnam almost the same amount of time, but prior to me. And when he came home, I got to talking with him a lot. And he had a attitude like, these are second-class, lower people. And he was very negative, and he would tell me some of the bad things that Americans did over there. And I'm thinking, oh, this is terrible, you know? I got over to Vietnam, and I could see, and I have to admit, at times, even I got caught up in that attitude. But as far from a political point of view, I was kind of neutral going over. But by the time I left Vietnam, I could say, this is a civil war. This is no different than our American Civil War. These people are fighting for control of their country. Plan A, Plan B, you know. We had no business over there. And the continuation of that war, the actual start of the war, all the way accumulating into the wall in D.C., which I have visited. Those 55,000 names are there because of our political people. It was our government, not our individuals as a country. And I'm very, very disappointed to this day over our point of view that we had at the time. Even McNamara has since come out with his recant, so to speak, saying we should not have been there, and I have to agree. The predominant statement you kept hearing over there was this domino theory.
Mm-hmm.
All right, how many years has it been since Vietnam? 40, 45? Where's the domino effect? It didn't happen, really.
No, and actually, when you do the diplomatic history of it, you realize that the people higher up recognized it wasn't going to go the way really back, at least into the early 60s.
No.
That was outmoded. I mean, there was a general idea of fighting communism and stopping communist expansion, but that was all based on the assumption that the Soviets controlled everything, which wasn't really true. They start fighting each other as soon as they get us
Yes.
out of there. But
Yes.
for you, another thing that went on while you were there, I mean, in the spring of 1970, the Americans go into Cambodia. And how aware were you of what was going on at that point?
I was, at that point in time, I was in Saigon, which was roughly 80 miles from Cambodia border. And I knew some of people from the other branches of the service. You met people over there constantly. I saw President Nixon go on TV telling the American public we have not invaded Cambodia. And yet I saw these convoys almost on a daily basis going through Saigon. Huge convoys. And I talked to a few of the drivers of these convoys. And we had invaded Vietnam, invaded Cambodia. It was happening. And I'm thinking, wow, how much of the rest of the war, past and going on into the future, is our government, through the news media, going to flagrantly sometimes mislead the American public. Then I thought, my gosh, how gullible is the American public? And it's still going on today. Still going on today. A lot of the news, looking back with hindsight, you could see now the news media was controlled by our government. I became cynical over that. I saw more and more of it the longer I was in Vietnam. So you just didn't trust what was being told to you anymore.
Of course, at that point, certain chunks of the media were very much opposed to the government, too. But they had their own agendas, and so if you're trying to figure out what's really going on, you might have kind of a hard time.
Exactly. And because of the control the government had at that point, some of the stories weren't coming out. Some of the facts weren't coming out that should have been coming out, allowing the American public, if they chose to, evaluate the situation on their own instead of being guided to a decision. Those type of things probably would have helped. Maybe would have ended the war sooner. Who knows? Had it been available, starting with Eisenhower, who started bringing troops into Vietnam on up, maybe the war wouldn't have lasted hardly at all. Who knows? But yeah, it was surprising to see how much the news media kind of shifted gears over that period of time, from broadcasting the war and how we're winning to evaluating how many, body counts were a big thing and how many bodies were really, killed. You couldn't hide the fact that the Americans were killed because you had real body bags coming home. But how many of the Vietnamese, NVA and VC were being killed? Yeah.
Not to mention Vietnamese civilians caught in the middle.
Quite a bit of that. Over there, it was hard to say whether or not the civilians were truly VC, truly civilians, or even maybe NVA. You just didn't know over there.
All right. Now, one of the things that happens when people talk about Vietnam, or they think of it, there's various stereotypes and things that come to mind. One of them is that there's rampant drug use among American personnel and that kind of thing. How much or little of that did you see in the places where you worked?
It was always there. I remember at night, if you walk by some of the guard bunkers, you could smell a sweet odor coming out of some of the bunkers. There was absolutely any kind of drugs you wanted accessible to you. Drugs were being brought on the base by the civilians. If you got off the base, you could go into any area you wanted and buy anything you wanted. My last detachment away from the battalion headquarters was at a second concrete block factory halfway between Long Ben and Saigon. And I had built a small refrigerator, so to speak, a big insulated box. And we had a detachment of 100 guys. And it was my job to keep cold pop there for the guys. So every morning I would take a truck into a Vietnamese ice factory and buy these huge 4-foot long, 8-inch square blocks of ice, come back and throw it into the cooler. Every day I'd go in there, there was a older Vietnamese fella with a long hookah opium pipe. Come on over and smoke some with me while I'm here, while you're waiting for the ice. And I turned it down. I didn't do any of the drugs over there. But yeah, drugs were free, available, very cheap. If you wanted it, it was there. Anything you wanted.
To what extent did that seem to actually affect the performance of the units that you were with?
With the units I was with, I would say I did not see any effect at all. But then I wasn't watching for it either. I didn't see guys who couldn't make roll call in the morning, anything like that. I didn't see a lack of performance. I saw probably more an alcohol problem than I did a drug problem over there. Again, back in the United States, if you were 18 years old, you couldn't drink. Over there, there was no limit. And the EM clubs would serve anybody and everybody.
Okay. Another issue that comes up a lot has to do with racial tensions, and that you had a black power movement going on in the States, and some blacks thinking that, well, this is the white guys' war, or something else like that, or they were being picked on. And some people report there being different things going on in Vietnam, whether it was just self-segregation or things worse than that. Did you notice any of that kind of thing?
I saw it, but more from a periphery. On an individual basis, we had blacks in the battalion, and on a one-to-one basis, there was generally a lot of cooperation. Here was a job to be done. We had to do it. Okay. I did not see a lot of black petty officers. I did not see a lot of black officers at all. So the blacks I did see basically were even less than third-class petty officers, E4s, and they were basically considered common labor, you know. I won't say right or wrong. Different views today than I had back then, of course.
And when off duty, would they keep with themselves?
In a group at night, when you're on your own, there was segregation. And in some cases, very, very much segregation. In Saigon, there was even a small, again, I told you you could get your own apartment. There were certain sections in Saigon where it was black. And you did not cross that line at all. You knew to stay out. Okay, you weren't welcome. In a big group, there was at the last place I went to outside of my battalion, back to that concrete block factory, there were a group of blacks, and they were saying, "Why am I fighting this war? You know, what's the white man done for me?" And I could understand that, you know. And the blacks were primarily used quite a bit. I did get into LBJ, Long Ben Jail, on the periphery one day, and I saw behind the barbed wires those who were incarcerated, predominantly, very, very predominantly black. Okay, I don't remember a white face in that area there. So, yeah, there was tension there. Um, but my experience, basically, when the job had to be done, uh, we were together. We were one unit. We worked together.
Okay. And what was your view, I guess, of the Vietnamese people themselves? You had some contact with them in different places, in different situations. Did you have a general impression of them as a group or just by individuals?
Uh, I would say I left Vietnam with a very positive point of view. Did not quite develop the attitude, like I said, that my brother-in-law had. At first, I was kind of caught up in it because we were used to indoor flush toilets, for example, grass, okay, to be mowed. A lot of things that we take for granted here, you didn't see it over there. And suddenly you think, man, these people are behind times. They're not, we got to catch them up. And it became a priority. They didn't need the grass because they needed to be fed. They needed a place to be sheltered. A lot of people I saw in Vietnam, especially around the bigger cities and the bases, were transient people who had lost their homes, places to live, safety, that sort of thing. So, yeah, at first I thought, wow, I've got it so much better. We need to bring up their standard of living. And then when I left Vietnam, I'm thinking, what did we do to their standard of living? And I got along with the Vietnamese. I had a Vietnamese maid, so to speak, at my barracks at one of my stays in Saigon, and got to know her a little bit, and we were exchanging dictionaries. She would give me a Vietnamese to English dictionary, and I had some small paperwork which gave English to Vietnamese, and we exchanged dictionaries, and we were talking about how to learn the language. I met one girl at that Newport facility who ran a little cafeteria on the base, and I was getting to know her and her constraints as a female in a Vietnamese society, and how she, as a single female, had to be accountable to the culture, the people, her family, the family relatives, that sort of thing, when associating with a GI especially, let alone a single Vietnamese who might be courting her. So yeah, I got to know a little bit about the culture, and I wanted to know more, but it didn't always have, the opportunity wasn't always there.
Okay.
So I left with a very positive feeling. These were innovative people. They learned. I saw many vehicles on the side of the road where front end was propped up a little bit, and the whole crankcase, pistons and everything came out the bottom. They were doing repairs right there. They could make things work, substitute, change, whatever. Very, very intelligent people.
Okay. So when did you actually leave Vietnam then to go home?
I left on July 1, I think, and flew back via commercial through Okinawa, Japan. And I think it was Okinawa, I'm not sure. It was a big American B-52 base.
Quite possible.
And we were told when we landed, close all your window shades. And they taxied us right up to the terminal and ran us out through canvas tunnels into the terminal we weren't allowed to see. Then flew back into Seattle, Tacoma, and they told us at that time, we're going to process you out very, very quickly and get you home for the 4th of July, and then you can be processed out of the service or to your next duty station at a local facility. Mine turned out to be Great Lakes facility outside of Chicago. The interesting thing was, after when my paperwork came through to fly home, to be home by July 3, I think, they told us, we're going to give you the option. We recommend you fly home in civilian clothes. Because if you fly home in a uniform, you will be harassed quite a bit in the airports. So I flew home in civilian clothes, but you look back at it now and you're thinking, my goodness, an American uniform means I am serving my country. It should be held up with pride, and I'm proud that I did serve, even though it was Vietnam. The American public at that point in time was down on the American serviceman, misdirected. It should have been at the political level, not at the serviceman himself. And I see that happening today, and I'm very grateful for it. But then I was told to fly home in civilian clothes. That was wrong.
Now, at this point in time, you had signed up originally for this 30-month span. Were you expecting to have another duty station in the U.S., or what was going on?
Again, because I fell into that situation where they couldn't send me back to Vietnam for 12 months, they didn't quite know what to do with me. So they gave me the option. They could reassign me to another battalion. Who knows where I would end up serving. They could allow me to attend a Naval Reserve unit close to home, or they gave me an option of getting a full discharge. At that point in time, that was a no-brainer. I took the full discharge. So my active duty was 16 months, about 16 months of active duty, 13 in Vietnam, and started out as mid-range in the enlisted ranks and ended up E4, dropped one down. So I had it pretty good.
Okay. Now, what did you do then once you got back home?
Took a little time to spend with the family. I had a job waiting for me at my previous company because I was pulled out, and the law was they had to take me back at that time, even if there wasn't an opening. So I went back to work for them. Started building my own house. I had a daughter born 5 months after I got back from Vietnam. Remember back 5 months before that, I was in Hawaii with
Courtesy
my
of
wife.
your R&R, yes.
So there is a cause and effect there. Raised a daughter, went back to work, basically rejoined society. Did not have an issue getting back into society like a lot of others did at that point. I had it pretty good.
Okay. Now, did you stay with the same company, or did you go off on your own or change jobs?
I stayed with the same company for about a year, and then started exploring other possibilities and transferred a couple of different times. Basically, I was in the manufacturing world and not in the construction at all.
Okay. All right. To look back at the time that you spent in the service, how do you think that affected you, or what did you learn from it?
One, even though I did not see real combat, I was very proud of my time that I had spent with the company, or with the Seabees. I'm still a big Navy fan. I root for Navy over Army every football game. I'm proud of not Vietnam itself, because politically it was a bad move. And every Memorial Day I visit a specific grave in the local cemetery to remember the fallen Marine there. So what I did in Vietnam, I thought in the end probably didn't amount to anything, did not resolve anything, did not do anything for my country itself. But I'm glad I served.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very proud that I did serve.
Okay. I got another question that's just kind of a footnote, something we talked about earlier that I forgot to bring in. At Cam Ranh Bay, in that area, some of the security was provided by South Korean soldiers. What did you see of them or hear of them, or what impression did you have of that bunch?
Cam Ranh was a long peninsula, and at the very top of the peninsula was the rock troops. Those are the Korean troops. Coming down, you had Air Force with the big Cam Ranh Bay Air Force facility, Army units below that, and then at the end of the peninsula was my battalion. Mm-hmm. My experience with the rock troops there, we didn't have a lot of direct contact. Some we did, but you learned very quickly these guys are extremely serious about fighting a communist possibility in South Vietnam because of their experience with North and South Korea. And they were tough guys. Situations became very black and white with them. You will do this, you won't do that. They had my impression was, they had kind of a negative opinion of the South Vietnamese. Why aren't you standing up and fighting strongly for your country? Don't you realize what's going to happen if you don't cooperate, if you don't put your priorities in order? We were told by a couple of the rock troops there that when they do have a military operation, they would put the Vietnamese in front of them so that the Vietnamese would be fighting and the Koreans would back them up. But if they turned around and faced the Koreans would then shoot them, because the only way they wanted the Vietnamese to go was forward. Fight for your country. So it was very, very black and white. Tough guys. And when I was in Saigon, I would run into some different rock troops there, and you got the distinct impression that they were not well liked by my impression by the people, by the Vietnamese people, because they would turn things into a black and white situation and force the issue. So yeah, I was impressed with them. They had our battalion at the end of the peninsula, towards the end of my tour of duty, opened up a Navy SEAL training camp down there. Not for our SEALs, but for Vietnamese, taught partially by our SEALs and by the ROCs. And those guys were put through some very, very tough times. But yeah, it's a tough group of guys, very tough group of guys.
Okay. And there was one other thing that you had mentioned before the interview that is of some interest value. You were talking about, you'd heard various stories about interrogation techniques and
yes,
scaring people in certain ways, but you have an actual incident that you witnessed.
Again, in Vietnam, the enlisted man lived on rumors. You really didn't know, and rumors grew fast and furious. We had heard that the interrogation processes of captured VC or NVA were brutal at times. A lot of different stories, one of which is they would take a group of Vietnamese up into a helicopter and begin interrogation, and if they didn't cooperate, they were pushed out the door. No parachutes. One day, a friend of mine was trying out his new camera equipment with telephoto lenses, and we saw a helicopter stationary in the air, quite a ways up, which was very unusual. Helicopters had to be moving. If they were high up, they were going to a base, transporting something. If they were low, they were skimming the tree tops to avoid any kind of enemy fire. But this one was stationary, so he started taking pictures with his telephoto lens. We got the pictures back, and he showed me, here is a body falling right below the helicopter. I actually saw the body on this picture.
Yeah.
So the suspicion was that that was interrogation going on, and there was one that just didn't cooperate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it is a story that I've encountered in other interviews, not just by rumor, but by, in some cases, eyewitness accounts. I mean, that kind of thing did happen. Koreans did it. We did it. South Vietnamese did it. Another reminder that war is a pretty nasty business.
Sun Yat-sen, Chinese general, thousands of years ago.
Sun Tzu.
Sun Tzu. You do what you have to do, and you do it efficiently.
And his number one rule was to avoid war entirely.
Exactly. War doesn't, Eisenhower said it, war doesn't solve a problem. It doesn't end the problem.
That's part of why we record these stories, is it makes sure people know the range of things that actually happen. So I'd like to just close here by thanking you for taking the time to come in and share the story today.
There's a lot of stories out there. I think mine is one of the behind-the-scenes stories. I would like to see more of that happening. I like to read the books on Vietnam, and almost all of them are about the combat situation, not about the people behind the scenes that were supporting these combat individuals. Yes, they had it bad. When I was in Vietnam, I fired 60 rounds out of my rifle, but it was on a rifle range sighting it in. Okay, I didn't have to shoot at anybody, thank goodness. I did get shot at. I did go through mortar and rocket attacks, but I was behind the scenes. There was no rear in Vietnam, per se. Not like you saw in World War II and even perhaps in Korea, where there was a front moving forward. War was all over. But there were a lot of support people making those combat situations possible.
Yeah, and it was 80 to 90% of the personnel there were in one form or other doing that. Yeah.
So
we're glad to be able to get your story and add it to the group. So thank you.
I thank you for the opportunity.